imparting frameworks from on high could work, but really the detailed responses to ecological restoration and health are going to be at the community scale. We need to be able to take measurements and create modeling systems based on responses to our actions at the local level. So I see the way that the global textile community starts to see benefit and positive feedback loops, which would be lowering emissions in the atmosphere, restoring aquifers, enhancing biodiversity metrics. For those feedback loops to take place, we fundamentally need every community to figure out how to handle aquifer restoration, how to handle soil carbon sequestration in their home communities. So I guess I would say the answers are decentralization. The answers are investing in communities to create these responses at the local level, and functionally to decentralize manufacturing, because through the laws of thermodynamics, there's just no way we can keep up this idea of moving non-perishable goods, which we can do because currently they're non-perishable, not like the food supply. We're moving them huge distances to manufacture them, but we've been doing that because we've externalized the costs of carbon. So we really do need to consider the decentralization movement, which will give brands kind of a bespoke selection of manufacturing centers across the world that will reflect the terroir of those regions. So I think it's going to be a beautiful future if we just kind of open ourselves up to the idea, the paradigm shift of what it means to decentralize some of these systems. I'll leave it there.
That's a great start. How about you, Aroa? Tell us what you envision as a regenerative fashion future.
Yeah, so I think it's, and hi Rebecca, it's nice to see you again. I think it's, so to me, when it comes to regenerative fashion, I think there are three principles that always we need to take into account. One is that it actually produces positive environmental outputs, so positive environmental impacts, and that's where we really need to go into textile fibers that are at the moment the only ones that offer us these, and regenerative agriculture. And then there are other two layers that really relate to what Rebecca has said, that is minimizing externalities. The moment the industry has, so many, such massive environmental externalities, and there are many ways to reduce them, but one key one is through localization and through really, opening up to the beauty of like how do more local supply chains look like in the fashion industry. So really minimizing externalities. And then the third one, using fashion as a healing tool for society, which until now it hasn't been really. So there is like a lot of negative dire social impacts of the fashion industry that don't rely only on worker exploitation, but that relate to, I don't know, cultural appropriation and lack of diversity and many issues. And I think, when we talk about regenerative fashion, for sure, while the core is, connecting it to regenerative agriculture, we also need to think about what role can such a big industry, which is producing a good that is not necessary, in terms of we have enough clothes in the world to go around, like forever, we don't need more clothes. What role does it have to play in also healing us and bringing us back together as society?
Fantastic observations there. It sounds to me that the evolution of the fashion industry in order to become more regenerative is similar to many other industries that we have that currently, bring a lot of problems and pollution, especially the food system, and how this all relates in with farming, like many of us are focused on now. And from there, I'd like to ask, what clothing production methods from the past and from indigenous cultures can inform the global clothing industry, as well as what new technologies offer hope for responsible textile farming and manufacturing? Because it seems like the two need to go hand in hand for us to be able to move forward and address the modern problems that we are seeing in this industry at large. Perhaps starting with Aroa.
Oh, I think Rebecca will have much more to say about this because of her background expertise. But so I think, so there is like some new technologies that definitely are relevant here, especially when it comes to helping us really measure, and leverage the latest science when it comes to regenerative agriculture, and giving farmers the guidelines and the visibility that they need because of the measurement tools that we have. So new technologies have a role to play, but I think effectively is like you say, we need to look into the past. And I think especially in the fashion, well, not especially in the fashion industry, in so many industries, but in fashion, there is this huge conversations about innovation in quite bizarre ways often. And it feels like we are looking to technology to save us from some problems that technology has created. And what we need is to change our mindset and really understand that no technology is going to save us from unchecked consumption and from complete disconnection from our supply chains. No, so it's effectively about looking at what are the ways that we produce throughout all of our history that kept a balance with nature, and recovering those practices and those technologies, and understanding that some things shouldn't be scaled and productivity shouldn't be maximized in all areas, and that products have a price that is higher and that we need to pay for.
I love that response. Thank you. And I would just second all of that, and that idea that some things don't need to be maximized. I was just reflecting as you were speaking about a post I saw, like a decolonizing post. It was a quote from a British military official who was defining nation states in Africa, places that he'd never been. He was creating new political boundaries to define those countries, politic, tax base, etc. And in the quote, it was like, there are mountains I've never seen, there are rivers I've never crossed, but I have the ability to define the future of this landscape. And here, where I am in the western part of the United States, I work with tribal leaders who say, you should read what the Pope originally said when they sent the explorers from Spain to what is now North American continent and South American continent. Anything they could see was the land of, it became incorporated into the land of the Spanish, into their government. So it wasn't about knowing landscapes. It wasn't about understanding ecosystems. It was just, the colonizer mind is just about appropriating what you can see or you can put on a paper. But how do we solve ecosystem collapse with that mindset of not really being intimate with anything? And I think we have to really, that colonized mindset is still in things like, frankly, the Hague Index. It's still in things that tell us what sustainability is, because it's measuring things from way far away and appropriating and extrapolating little bits of measurement across broad landscapes. It reminds me so much of the map makers from the last colonized era, this idea that you can extrapolate measurement in one thing and say everyone's doing this, when a cotton field can have literally different water usage and pesticide and insecticide usage from one corner to the other. There's so much variability in these systems and heterogeneity that I think that the indigenous heart of our planet, we all have that. We all have an indigenous place. We all have a place where we came from that we were connected to. And some of us still have that. But those of us who are transplants, who are looking at, what was the ecosystem's way of being, or the way of being with ecosystems that worked, like here in California, it's 13,000 years of management of redbud and sedge and all of these plants that were used for watertight baskets and some of the dress forms. And those plant species, like here's just one example. There's an area north of us that, about the California fires, right? And so you've seen these neighborhoods completely flattened in ash. Those areas in Santa Rosa, Sonoma County, are areas that were historically covered, like a square mile of where those Kofi home burns keep happening. they are actually in this downward slope of a huge fire corridor, and that's been known for 13,000 years. And that fire corridor used to hold dogbane, massive amounts of the fiber crop that supported fish weir development, textile development, string, rope. It's our native hemp in California. And there was literally, the Native Americans say, well, if you want to call what we were doing industrial, we were doing industrial production of this crop, but we were allowing it to, reseed and rhizomously spread. And we planted it in the fire corridor because it regenerates in those fire ecologies. So that fiber system was literally consciously put in the wave of fire. Now for us, the colonizer mind comes in and says, let's put homes there and take up the fiber system that was indigenous. And so it's just one example of kind of well, if you don't pay attention to landscapes, you pay the price. And I think that at this point we have, as you're saying, like this need to connect, but the connection isn't just because it's a nice thing to do. I think our survival depends on it. So yeah, just leave it there.
Well, that goes in depth to what you were talking about for your vision of a regenerative fashion world, of this decentralization that is correctly adapted to its place and its resources, as well as the biological and cultural history of a place, that kind of all work in harmony when done at a correct scale, or even, we'll not call correct bad, good, I don't like those labels, but something that is appropriate to the unique conditions and the context of where you find it. Aroa, do you have reference to those types of things and this balance between, I guess, production methods, but also this idea of rooting the sources of your materials and the way that they're used from the way that people have interacted with them in those places historically?
Yeah, we do. But I must say it's really difficult for us as a brand, like now wearing the brand hat. So at the moment, so at Trace Collective, we only source linen from Western Europe and hemp from Eastern Europe, which are crops that have been grown there for like millennia by local population. No? And linen in Europe has always been, but that's why the word linen comes from like bed linen, and linen was the fabric that we had at home and that we did at home and that we had knowledge of how to do. If you wanted clothes, you had to grow linen in your house in the past in many areas. So we do have kind of like talk to farmers and make sure that there was this consistency across, like history and the practices being used. But what we find really as a barrier is that we haven't been able to find local systems that take grow the fabric and connect to the mills and give us the end outputs that that we need in the quantities that we need as a fashion brand. So we also work with like other mills and check with them kind of like farmer integrity and like how farmers are growing, and to make sure that we are avoiding like industrial farming. But so it's quite challenging. I guess what is quite interesting and came to my mind as Rebecca was speaking is that this very local quality of sustainability that we tend to forget. And I think that is a trap that we really fall into in the fashion industry and us, in the lack of a better system where, we have these big certifications that at the moment are the only tool that most brands have to understand what is it that they are buying. But obviously those certifications leave out so much of the local context of, like what each region and each bioregion needs and like what is sustainable there and what should be grown there. It's not only about growing organic cotton, but like it's where are you growing it? And yeah, I think that's like a really interesting challenge where, effectively you see that you need to build those close relationships with farmers and get that visibility and like really connect to those origin stories if you want to go deep into what is sustainable and what is regenerative, and into understanding the impact of your production. And I must say, for us, we are like only halfway there right now. It's really complex.
I'm really glad how you touched on it there. It's like fashion is a very large and multifaceted industry, and so far I've kind of been talking about it as if it were one thing, but there are so many steps along that line, from the farmers to the distributors and all of the processes of manufacturing before it actually makes it to retail and the consumers themselves. And so let's start back at the beginning a little bit and talk about how, like many other commodity farm products, we're often told that the only fiber production business models that are viable are these large scale operations, much like commodity farming of food as well. Do you have any examples of small scale fiber producers that are respectably profitable? I know both of you kind of work at that smaller scale, maybe starting with Rebecca.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It depends on the fiber. And I was actually just having this reflection with someone who works at a large uptake brand, global global brand yesterday. And I was reflecting on cotton systems because, you know, in the United States, a lot of folks are like, well, why are all the farms so big for cotton? And, you know, one of the key, if not in the top 3 reasons for why the scale is what it is because that the cotton farmers in the US are competing with cotton farmers in countries that have very different relationships to hierarchy and labor. And the United States, I mean, we have gone through so much in cotton systems, and it shows up in the suppression of a whole community of people, and it's still unfurling. Like that use of slave labor, the effects of that we are living today. And so cotton, to me, the fact that it's gone to the scale it has is because those growers need to use mechanized equipment. There's very few small scale growers who can remain effective because of the labor situation, and that we're competing with countries whose moral arc of justice hasn't been fully expressed yet. And we're still in our journey of that expression of justice coming home to roost. It's layer and layer and layer. We keep having an expression of justice and a retraction, and an expression and a retraction. And that shows up in the agricultural systems. And so I think part of the reason we're so large in the US with our cotton production is due to the fact that we're competing with countries that have been suppressing communities still in many cases, and that hand-picking cotton is still something that's very much done in other parts of the world. Sometimes it's done in a just system, but in many cases it's done in an unjust system. So I have a different relationship with cotton and scale because of the history in the United States of slavery. I also would say, though, that at a small scale, most of the fiber producers that are profitable are using, like, sheep, for instance, as part of an organic food crop rotation, or they're using sheep in their vineyard systems. There's very profitable wine and food production systems that can layer fiber producing animals. Those are profitable. You don't need a lot of animals to do that. It's more of like an expansive market garden who might mow down their cover crop with a handful of sheep, who are then, you know, sheared, and maybe some of that yarn makes it out to the farmer's market. But the engine of the economy for a small scale grower, at least in our region, remains the food system. And it's the specialty crops that continue to be the bread and butter of the agricultural community. And the animals are part of an ecological function tool. So I guess I don't have as much, it's hard for me to say, like, oh, cotton should just be small scale and hand picked, because our country's been there and it's not pretty. So I don't have the same, like, scale to me is all about how is justice being served for land and people, and maybe our questions around scale, you know, start getting more nuanced. Yes.
Yeah, very good example there.
Yeah, on our side, so we do know of, like, farmers that are profitable and making it work small scale with flax in Europe. So I know of examples in Western Spain. Sorry, I always get my east and west confused. Western Spain, and also in the north of France. But like, it's really challenging, and it's something that they emphasize all the time. It's just really challenging, and it's because I think also when it comes to our governments and government incentives are not incentivizing farmers to stay small. So very often in many European countries, incentives are given according to the amount of land that you have, which could make sense in a way. But then what that means is that farmers who have very small farms actually qualify for almost no support, and they are always under pressure to sell their lands to others who are like expanding. So like, it's definitely like, we know of examples that are working, but our concern right now is like, how do we protect those and how do we replicate those? Because there's a very clear tendency, because of markets and governments, to disappear. And I think there's also, sorry, just one last thought. At least in the cases that I know, there's also a part of losing cultural heritage with a generational change. So it's really common that just newer generations don't want to work in the farms, and we are losing that knowledge. That, for example, when I think of Western Spain and linen production there, it's very like an artisan knowledge where they go through all the steps of like flax transformation into linen, and that is being lost because because no young people want to take on that trade because it's not where you can make most money.
You had mentioned smaller scale flax operations being profitable. Can you give me an idea of the scale that you're referring to?
No, not really. In terms of
land size? Yeah.
Of land size, I don't know on the top of my head, but I could tell you afterwards. So I know from talking to them, and no, on the top of my head.
I'm just thinking it's probably going to be of interest to the farmers who are on this call.
It's something I can follow up on afterwards.
Fantastic. And Rebecca, do you have similar examples? Because you had mentioned about smaller scale operations being profitable with leather and especially animal products. Are you also have you seen the utilization of waste products into novel or new forms of fibers? For example, unfortunately, the panelist who wasn't able to be here, Umaima, has been pioneering pineapple and banana fibers as waste products from the industries in Bangladesh. Have you seen potential in these types of products in your area?
We're getting there. Yes, I think the technology company that we are excited about, who's circling around California and other parts of the world, who has a biorefinery model. It's AgroLoop, and I'm sure there's other companies too that are looking at this model where so you can use banana, pineapple, and those are not crops that work in our location because we're a more temperate climate. But yes, the flax tow, so the shorter staple flax, we're looking at how that can be turned into maybe even a filament, but possibly just a well-spun yarn. It's a very tricky process because you need things not to pill, not to break, and so these shorter fibers that you see in so many food crops, it's a real science to get that to be a durable textile. So the systems we're looking at are, if cannabis-focused hemp growing, it creates very bushy crops, but that's primarily where the American hemp industry so far has gone. Of course, we've overproduced cannabis producing, we have flooded these markets, but those who end up retaining in the hemp market, there's definitely ways that we could use even those bifurcated stems, and through certain systems, those shorter staple fibers from hemp or flax could be used into yarn development. It will take more technology because we don't have a lot of fiber focused hemp growers. Maybe there's some on the panel, but I haven't seen that the economics work in the US for people just to grow hemp for fiber. We're still trying to figure out all the different ways. You need value added systems because in so many ways for hemp to work. For instance, like it's not just the textile manufacturing systems you need to understand how to create the herd economy. And is the herd going into animal bedding? Is it going into hempcrete or building? And all of those systems all the value addition systems have to be invested in kind of at once for the farmer to be able to make use of all the products that come off that crop. It's a dynamic crop. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of time before we see more agricultural material that wouldn't traditionally be used for a textile being used. It's just an investment issue, more so than anything else.
Sure, the infrastructure has to be easy for the producers to access, because if there pretty much any point of friction or difficulty in the process is going to marginalize it as a waste product the way it has been up until now, I would imagine.
Yes, yes. And we hope that when we have these kind of investment conversations about building up our manufacturing sector in our country, that people will take textile into consideration, because it's a wonderful a sector of the economy that we could be breathing more life into.
Okay, well, it seems to me that the difficulty here is making the argument or making the case that this can compete with the synthetic fibers, and especially dyes and other processes like nylon and acrylic and others that have flooded the market and become the cheap alternative that is really fueling fast fashion and these other symptoms of the industry at large that are difficult to compete with in this decentralized and bespoke industry that we're somewhat advocating for here. Can you make the case for not only why this is important on a ecological I guess, aspect or perspective, but what are the other benefits that can help to bring meaning behind the higher costs of a better way of producing all types of fibers and clothing? Starting with Aroa.
Yeah, it's right now we need to completely change how our textile pie looks like. At the moment, I think like latest data from Textile Exchange is that 63% of global textile production is synthetics, which is insane. It's like we are using non-renewable resources to produce fabrics that are going to stay there forever, kind of, and damage all across the supply chain. And so, I mean, are there other arguments besides of the environmental one? I think the environmental one is the most important one, but I think there is a lot to speak about, just building this connection with the story behind the product that you buy, and I think just put it in a very blunt way, I personally don't want to wear plastic, it's like, I mean, and it's like quite basic and we've gotten used to it, but just wearing a polyester t-shirt as opposed to wearing a cotton t-shirt or like a wool jumper, it's a completely different way on how it interacts with your skin, just the connection that you create with it. So I think there's also like this human, not only on the touch, but also this human storyline of, well, you're buying a product, this product has a story. You can be buying something that is like completely man-made, completely opaque, completely polluting, or you can be buying something that you can trace back, hopefully, like if we get to a degree of transparency in the fashion industry, that that you can trace back to a farmer, and to the land that is around you, and that when you don't need it anymore, will go back into that land. So obviously, I think the environmental argument is the most important one, but there's also this really important part of reconnecting with the products that we buy and understanding how, in a way, we're only a small part of the supply chain, right? There's so much that happens before us and so much that happens after, and our decision of what kind of product do we purchase creates that story. Yeah.
So just to reflect, I love everything that you've said, and just to reflect on the question about affordability or how do we compete? I mean, is that okay? Well, I've been thinking a lot about the transformation of this industry into something that includes service and experience. And instead of just pumping out goods, which has already been mentioned, like we're flooded, we're over consuming, we have surpluses that we aren't even, there's inventory surpluses, there's consumer goods that are in surplus that are already on the rack that get burned there or incinerated because they don't get sold. Too much, there's already too much. So I'm wondering about the industry if looking at a model of service whereby you take a higher priced good and you know, and there are businesses doing this, but you start bringing in a culture of repair, not just, again, a company coming in and using the idea of circularity as another form of centralizing wealth and power, but to think about decentralizing the process of making sure clothing circulates in a community. Like we always say, like local dollars, you want a dollar to circulate as much as possible. The most beautiful, prosperous communities are where currency circulates over and over and over again in that community and does not get extracted out. Clothing is a similar, it's a currency. How can you keep it circulating in the community for as long as possible? What are the beautiful strategies that we've been missing because we've moved so quickly into the idea of disposability? But what are the beautiful ways of keeping the clothing in play through trading that clothing together freely, taking the commodification out? But could some of these smaller brands who have a focus on their community, or even large brands, I don't know what their strategy would be, but the idea of hosting the clothing swap, we hosted a mending bar at a design school in San Francisco. People came and drank some beer and sewed their buttons and changed their hemlines. You know, we rolled sewing machines in and needles and threads so that the culture of repair became a true culture. And so the service there was creating the bar and getting the machines and the tools, but the experience was people sitting around and talking to each other and having a good time connecting socially while keeping their clothes in play. And then people started trading their clothing. People started putting on each other's pieces. We put a photo shoot together. We brought a photographer that we work with. So she took photos of everyone's pieces and they got a photo of their mended piece. So we can slow fast fashion down. And I don't think all the business models should be, nor should we be incentivizing the big companies just to put boxes in their stores. Here, come back and get a discount on your next thing. Like we shouldn't use circularity as an excuse to grow this system. We need systems that slow the whole thing down and change the consumption model so that maybe a higher priced good that's 100% natural fiber has a way longer arc of time. So if you amortize the cost of it, it actually is saving you money. My great grandmother said, I'm too poor to buy cheap. Like I can't afford cheap. It's crazy. What are you doing? It's gonna fall apart. So if we have that adage, if we take that forward and we say, well, people don't have enough money up front, so can you like slowly make a payment on that thing that's a little higher price? That's already in existence. Some of the brands I know and love allow you to pay $15 a month, and after 4 months, you own it. That's another way we could help. But I think we have to create services, experiences, decentralize the idea of circularity, and maybe some of these brands will also find somewhat of a profit model in some of that. I'm not all for finding ways to profiteer off a degrowth model, but we all, there might be strategies that are still in service to the social repair work and the fabric repair work that we all have at hand. So, yeah.
I love the story of that event, and I've been to similar ones myself. I wish that there was a bit more of a culture, especially on the masculine side of things, in interacting with clothing and repair and stuff. And I know that there is in other cultures, and it's something that I look forward to reconnecting with. I'm fortunate that both my partner and her mother know how to sew and are often mending things that I destroy. But it seems like reinvigorating the interaction and the process of the things that we own can more than justify the higher price, like you were mentioning, when you look at it as something that is an investment as much as you would perhaps, investing in a house or a piece of land, something that's going to be a major presence in a longer portion of your life, rather than something that you kind of go through your whims and through your wants and is transitory in that process as well. Which makes me wonder, because of all of the positive aspects of reconnecting with these things, and I know for myself too, I value things more when I spend more money on them, and I've certainly heard that adage of not being wealthy enough to buy cheap things certainly applies for tools as well, since my background's more in construction. But
It really applies to tools, yes.
definitely applies to tools, but it really does. It has very broad appeal and broad application. And this makes me wonder, like, what are some of the biggest roadblocks? What are some of the biggest hurdles for the expansion of regenerative textiles and fashion? Where are you feeling the most pushback? Whoever wants to start.
I just,
Aroa?
oh,
Yep. You can go ahead, Rebecca.
No. If you want to think more about it, I can jump in.
No, I'm happy. So, I mean, basically, I think there are two sides, right? One is like market. So, well, there's one side that is market incentives, and we have there like consumer demand, but also like other, like set of incentives around policy and, and so when it comes to consumers, definitely we are talking about price points, but like, again, it's what Rebecca was saying, and you were saying, we just need to step away from this culture that has been fed into us of like, we need to have so many different things, and go back to actually having a few things that we really treasure and that we want to keep for life. But it's very difficult for consumers alone to make that mindset switch, like taking into account all of market dynamics. And I think, effectively the problem today with fashion is that it's much more profitable for a brand to not be regenerative and to be very damaging than to actually take responsibility for their supply chain and take responsibility for the products that they put out on the world, because that's also a really important component for all companies in the world, not only talking about, fashion, but like companies are not taking responsibility for what they put out, like responsibilities eventually, passed on to the consumer and then to the government, and this happens in fashion, but it happens also when you buy a bottle of Coke, or like, the waste that is produced throughout the process is not something that companies are taking responsibility for. And that's because like, they don't have to, basically, like we can get away with not doing that. So I think a really important enabler is, governments stepping up to level the playing field. And this is something that in the UK has been discussed for a while. And for example, last year, I don't know, my time is quite fluffy since the pandemic happened. Maybe this was 2 years ago, but there was a vote in Parliament to put a tax on fast fashion. And it was, for me, an historic moment, like to say, like, this makes so much sense because, these companies are damaging the planet and we are all going to have to pay for it. But unfortunately, it wasn't voted. It didn't pass. So I think, one of the key barriers is the inability to compete evenly. And I think for that to happen, there needs to be government intervention, but for government intervention to happen, there needs to be enough citizen support, so there is like a lot that needs to happen around like raising awareness and consumers speaking up and voting with their purchase, but also voting, like writing to their MP and like writing to fashion brands and showing that there is this movement and this traction. And I think there is like another part that I'm sure like Rebecca and I mean, you guys at Climate Farmers can really talk about, but is making sure that there is enough support for, like when it comes to farmers to be able to make this transition towards more regenerative practices. and when in terms of know-how, financial support, measurement, visibility, but also that there is enough demand from fashion brands to really like make sure that it financially pays off.
I love everything that you said, and I do feel like we're going to need the role of our role as citizens has to take a very, we need to ramp up, because as policies are shaped to incentivize regenerative agriculture or smaller scale agriculture, the impediment to the regulatory frameworks that we need and the incentives frameworks that we need has been the role, at least in ag in the United States, of Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, or Syngenta, or DuPont, or Dow. Like, those companies have been shaping farm policy in the United States for quite some time. So as fashion becomes a target for regulation, we have the same issues to be concerned about. Who is going to be at the table shaping that policy? Our governor recently appointed, I found out, a circular economy roundtable and appointed the largest textile companies to the table. The NGOs weren't asked to participate. So I have to have a little conversation with our state government about what's going on with that. So I do think we are all, there's this huge push to say fashion needs to be regulated, but we have to be extremely careful that we are ready as a society to step up and make those public comments, to get into those halls of power, because those policies could very easily start greasing the wheels for exactly what we don't want, because that's what's happened in agriculture, and fashion could just be another pitfall if we don't step up. So I think, yeah, we need to level the playing field, and regulation has a position in that, but regulation has to be, again, carefully watchdogged by many for this to come out in the way that we don't just have ecological collapse and biodiversity collapse and human, bye-bye humans, which is really exactly where we're headed at the moment. So there's work to turn this around, but we can't have the fox guarding the chicken coop in the leveling of the playing field process. The other thing about regenerative ag, because farm policy has been shaped so long by conglomerates who make money off of patents and proprietary chemistry, we have a real problem with thoughtful technical assistance providers, meaning who's on the landscape helping the agrarian community make the transitions in, let's say, production agriculture. In the US, unlike the rest of other parts of the world, the US still, the large farms technically are the suppliers of our fiber and food in many cases. We do have some pockets of decentralized food and fiber production, but production ag is still predominantly what's here. And I have a problem when I walk into production ag systems, and I even have money in my pocket from whatever, a grant or support, to have that farmer make a transition to multi-species cover cropping or compost applications versus synthetic nitrogen use, or let's wean off these chemicals and move here to these other practices, or let's focus on soil biology. There's knowledge gaps. It doesn't mean people aren't trying and there aren't people trying to bridge these deltas, but there are functionally knowledge gaps in the system. And that is because our land grant universities in the US have also been predominantly bought. In many cases, the departments are very influenced by private dollars coming from the same companies that are shaping policy. We know all this, but I think it really shows up when you're trying to make change and you don't have the right technical assistance. Money might even start rolling in, like governments are making shifts, right? Governments are starting to do little things, at least at the state and the county level where we are, to incentivize a different form of agriculture. But then who's bridging your knowledge gaps? Because there's like a literally, as you were saying, like it takes one generation to lose a textile recipe. It can take one generation to lose an understanding of how to do organic agriculture without tilling the soil to pieces. We have this move to no-till, but I saw some recent status of like Vermont no-till, like they're seeing so much more herbicide runoff in their streams because no-till is coming with herbicide use in mass. That's not the solution to trying to reduce soil disturbance and build soil carbon. It's not that we then come with herbicides in large quantities to solve for our soil disturbance issues. So again, we just see knowledge gaps. So I really, really hope, again, just to summarize, we step up as citizens and make sure we're shaping the regulation and incentives policies and making public comments when those opportunities arise, that we're supporting in the United States a different way to bridge the knowledge gap than what the chemical industries have given us, and that we really support each other to have solutions that are decentralized, not patented, and not just proprietary. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Okay, so now we've covered all of the bad news. These are the things that are in your way that are causing this to be difficult to implement or to grow. Let's talk about some of the things that have given you hope or inspired you that things are starting to move in the right direction. Aroa, what have you seen in your line of work that has given you that hope?
So to me, what gives me a lot of hope is that now we are talking about regenerative agriculture in fashion. A lot more, not a lot, you know, in objective terms. We should talk about it much more, but a lot more. And I feel like this has been a change, and I would love to hear from you, Rebecca. When do you think, you know, you saw this change? But to me, really, I've seen a massive change in the last 2 years, which is since we've been working on it. And I don't know if it's like I'm looking harder at it, but really when we started at Trace, it was very difficult to find people holding this conversation. Fibershed, I would say, was the only one. Suddenly, in the last years, thanks to the work of like the Savory Institute and some very big fashion brands, obviously Patagonia, some very big fashion brands are starting this conversation of how they can embed, you know, like environmental regeneration and regenerative agriculture in their supply chains. And I think that's really important because, you know, ultimately they are the people that have the microphone in a lot of occasions. And, you know, just putting this in the conversation and their ability to reach consumers with this message is really important because, I mean, we here all understand, you know, that nature-based solutions are key to fighting climate change and that regenerative agriculture has a very important role. But most of the mindset and the conversation around sustainability is in damaging less and not in actually healing and repairing. And the fact that we are starting to see, you know, like in different industries, these pockets and these like organizations that are really amplifying the potential of regenerative agriculture and the potential to heal our planet, it gives me so much hope. You know, it just feels like there is momentum and lots of good things can happen from this. Is like, as Rebecca is saying, if we get the right people around the table and we make sure that we get the right policies around the table.
Nicely said. I agree. We've got a lot of traction that's starting to build with conversations like this, where we're bridging regenerative ag and fashion. I mean, these are new conversations. I mean, you'll see some brands who are kind of coming out the gate with claims and comments and work, and it, you know, I see all of it as a gradient. Like we just need to keep pushing on the leading edge of the work all the time, and hopefully, you know, just a few good players keep being really good role models for what this can look like. We can keep setting the foundations for everyone to kind of jump on board who may not have been having the privilege to pay enough attention to the sector, which would be the wearer in most cases. They don't have the time. They're going to need to trust, you know, some of the new transparency tools that we bring in place, and localize, so you can walk in those fields and understand what's happening. The distance between the wearer and the field is a chasm that needs to be bridged, because ultimately we need to have sensitivity for how these things are grown and produced. But anyway, yeah, should I be answering anything in the chat? There's some brilliant questions in here.
There's some really good questions in here, and we're going to start with them real soon. I wanted to ask one last question before we turn it over to listener questions, and that is, how can people who are not directly involved in the fashion industry or the textile or the farming industry help to move the needle in the right direction in this entire, this entire aspect of our culture? Rebecca?
Oh, how to move the needle if you're not already involved in the industry?
Yeah.
Well, I think right now there's opportunities to, again, just keep your clothing in play. So whatever you're wearing, there's a wonderful Tiwa Pueblo tribal elder or leader, I would say. He's not quite yet an elder. And so anyway, I was just hearing stories about cotton production in the Southwest before the land was colonized, and clothing made of this cotton was considered sacred. And clothing had a sentience to it. And I've told this story before, but I keep coming back to this idea that we aren't putting enough attention and respect into the actual garments, that they're protecting us, that they're keeping us warm and in comfortable environments, that we can have these social engagements without being unclothed. I mean, these fundamental, they seem like laughable realities, but really textile is shelter. And so I think part of it is just, if everyone kind of thanks their clothing, like a little gratitude for the service that the clothing offers. I think that's the indigenous heartbeat, you know, start with gratitude, start with thanks for whatever clothing you have, regardless of its fiber content, and work to keep it in play. And then from there, if you buy new or secondhand, you know, look, even in the secondhand market, look for clothing that's 100% natural, so that those fibers, you know, the more used plastic garment is, the more it fragments those fibers into the ecosystem. So even when you're buying secondhand, look for natural. If you can foster clothing swaps in your community to keep clothing in play. And then lastly, if you buy new and you have that opportunity and privilege, then look for people you can support in your home community. And if you can't support people in your home community or brands that are somewhat local and transparent to you, and you have to go to the certification body, I mean, definitely it's helpful to look for an organic certification. I'm not gonna say that that's not helpful, but GOTS, Global Organic Trade Certification, there's, you know, it's better than, it's the best we have. So we'll just go with that. And we have a lot of work to do on certifications and transparency as a whole. But those would be my recommends.
Yeah, and I will echo most of that. I think what fashion offers us is that really the possibility that everybody can get engaged in moving the needle, because we all wear clothes, you know, as far as I know. So it's really about, I think, first reconnecting, because often, you know, we think of, oh, I'll just buy better, no? But yeah, it's not about buying, but like first reconnecting with our wardrobe, what we have at home. There is a really cool organization. They are still actually like a student collective who prepared like a wardrobe audit tool that is called like Closet Mass Index, and it's these little templates that you sit with in front of your wardrobe, and you really try to understand what's in there, you know, and like understand the journeys behind the products, and you check the labels and you understand what they are made of, and you understand where they were made of. And I went through that actually not so long ago, and it was such an empowering thing, because it gave me a lot of information, most of it pretty unpleasant, about what was sitting in my wardrobe, but also it really recommitted me to just honoring my clothes and keeping them in use for as long as possible. And it also taught me what is it that is in my wardrobe that is actually really damaging, because it's, you know, it's synthetic fibers, and I need to be careful about how I wash them, and I need to be careful about how I dispose of them, because they are effectively, you know, like shedding microfibers forever. So I think understanding our clothes help us understand how to take care of them, so we can minimize the impact that they're having on the environment now. and also it can extend their life cycle, you know. And I think it's very beautiful to start learning again, understand, because many of us don't know, you know, like how to wash your clothes, you know, in the best way to really extend their life and minimize the impact. So I think it's first connecting with what you have at home, and then really looking to different ways of interacting with this industry, no? So avoiding to buy new products as much as possible, which really should be always. Like I own a fashion brand, but I don't buy new clothes since like 3 years ago. But like when you want to buy something new, really vote with your dollar, you know, like vote and go with brands that align with your values. And I think there's something really powerful about, like, I don't know, connecting our values with, correcting our actions with our values. And it's quite empowering to know, like, you know, I've supported this brand that I think is very cool. And now I have a piece that represents this.
It's like building a collection.
Yeah, of stories, you know? Yeah.
Great set of stories and memories and meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like with all these purchases and these decisions, you are building a collection. It's a matter of what kind of collection do you want to build, and what does that collection represent? What does it say about you and your priorities and what you invest in? Because as we covered in just a small part here, there are effects to all of these decisions at many, many stages of the process before it gets to you, and certainly before it goes on to decompose or, you know, an afterlife on its own. Now,
I'm sorry, Oliver,
let's hand things over.
Oh, sorry.
No,
one last thing that I wanted to mention is also, and this really depends on how much we each want to get engaged, but, you know, my journey is that I started going down that tunnel and I ended up here. So, you know, like, there's always, like, when we want to go the extra step, there are so many, you know, options to really demand transparency and demand change from brands. And I do think that makes a big difference. So for example, Fashion Revolution on their website has a template where, you know, it just takes you 2 seconds to go pick your brand, and it sends them an email, you know, like saying, like, I want to know who made my clothes, you know, and like what's behind my clothes. And I think, like, the more that brands get these requests from customers or potential customers, the more they will understand that really, you know, their model needs to change. And you know, there is a template for that, but there's always, you know, the possibility of emailing a brand and being like, listen, I really like this piece, but I want to understand what's it made of or where was it made. And yeah, and I think that's cool as consumers that we take that extra step.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Fantastic. Well, look, there's so much more that we can cover here, but I want to hand it over to the listeners. And before we go to them, I'd also like to encourage our participants to check out the video replay on Climate Farmer's YouTube channel shortly after this call, and also to look out for the broadcast of this panel discussion on the Regenerative Skills podcast, where, along with the weekly episodes that I publish, our expert panel discussions will come out once a month. Our previous one on regenerative agriculture is coming out this week. If we're not able to get to your questions this time, or if you're watching the recorded version later on, just remember that the conversation will continue on our Mighty Networks page. And I'm putting that link in the chat now. And also, of course, if you rewatch this later on YouTube, we'll have the link in the show notes below. And so I'm going to hand it over now to Ivo, who will be selecting participants and their questions to send to the two of you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much, Aroa and Rebecca. It was super, super interesting. And I loved especially so like in the end, like, you know, we each of us are the one to create the system. So let's make sure it's created in the way we want it. I would basically go through sort of from, you know, who posted first. So basically I would hand over to Felipe. Would you like to ask your questions then? Felipe Cardoso. If you do, you can unmute yourself if you want. Otherwise, I can also just read out the question. So Felipe says, congratulations on the work, Rebecca. California is a great friend for textural fibers. What is the biggest material used in production? And do you know the fiber of banana leaf and palm heart?
Good question. So we currently are just I call them the low-hanging fruit fibers in California. We are the largest wool producer in the country. So wool is about a third of our wool is very clearly something that could be used next to skin. So we have aggregated from ranches that are restoring their soil health or storing above ground carbon in silvopasture, hedgerows, riparian corridor restoration, and we've aggregated that wool. And we actually just put together a climate beneficial, which is what we're using. We work with the scientific community and different public agencies to put this climate beneficial program together. And for our rangeland grazing community, it has worked quite well. And we have a climate beneficial wool pool now. It was a COVID-19 response. Our ranchers were like, we're gonna go bankrupt. So we found a way to buy up the wool and put this wool pool together. So that got launched. The website was launched this morning, actually. And then we're also we're like one of the world's largest producers of extra long staple cotton. Cotton's just a complicated system. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the last, it's only been 2 years that we've really been focused on it, but that's where I think we see a lot of the knowledge gaps between organic and regenerative, and how are those going to come together in the cotton system without hand picking the cotton, because we don't have that option and we're not going to do that here. And then yes, I haven't worked with, was it palm heart? Was that the
banana leaf and palm heart?
So banana leaf is would be a crop more southern to us. Like our freezing temps wouldn't allow us to grow that at scale, so I have less visibility on how that would work. And the other was palm. Heart. We haven't used that for fiber, but that sounds really, really, again, we've kind of just approached like what's here and how to help mobilize the ag lands that are here and work towards transformation of those existing ag lands. But I am so excited to eventually diversify into like all the nooks and crannies and the potential of what our bioregion can grow. People do grow palm trees here. But
Good, thank you. And Holly, I don't know if you want to ask your question yourself. I'm happy to also read it out. If you do, just unmute yourself, please. So I'll just start reading it out. Holly, yes. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's been so interesting. My question, I guess comes from this. I feel like we need a sort of a way to transition to regenerative microsystems. My background is in the development of methods of garment production or textile form production that reduce the kind of reliance on manual labor, and I'm really interested in these like made to order automation. These like quite different to what a lot of people think of when they think of regenerative, like agriculture and that kind of thing. For me, I see that it's potentially a useful kind of approach in the context of decentralizing garment production. We're going to need maybe some new ways of making garments that fit into this decentralization model. How do you guys see the role of technology in moving us towards that kind of space?
I appreciate the question. It's good to see you, Holly. I would just say we have a brand that's working on that for denim here in the Bay Area, and it seems like the value of creating custom patterning through a computational or digital lens, and being able to then develop clothing that has a really curated way of coming around the shapes of the body. If that part, I don't know if that's the part you're also describing that would be automated. The idea that we could create clothing that people are very fluid in physically, and that we can try to match these natural fibers and get that mobility. That's we have like a design maybe delta there in some cases, because plastic's been part of the conversation for so long, and knits are cheaper than wovens. So we've seen a huge push towards these knit blends that are just not so great. Can't recycle them, the rag trade doesn't want them, they get incinerated at best, they end up in the landfill, and they release antimony trioxide. It's not good. So this idea you have is, to me, has a lot of efficacy. In combination, I always think like some levels of high tech mixed with like the craft culture, mixed with the deeper indigenous agroecological pieces. Like, I think there's a marriage between these things, because we don't want to waste what we end up producing off the field. So if you can minimize waste with zero fallout, you can create mobility so someone keeps their garment longer because the pattern is so succinct to their body. There's a lot of great potential in making real high value clothing in what I've heard you describe. And again, I don't know all the systems you're working with, but that's just at a high level my response from hearing what you've asked. Good question.
Anything to add from Aroa?
No, it sounds fascinating, but I think it's quite far away from kind of the work that we are doing or that we know of. So actually, I definitely agree that there is a lot of potential on made to order and like bespoke patterning, and it's something that we personally try to explore, not through, you know, like any technology automations, and we didn't, you know, we are not aware of what the right technology might be for that. So I would definitely be interested in learning more about your work, Holly. But yes, I think super interesting as a, you know, as a way to go, but I don't know, you know, where are we in that tech curve, and like sounds fascinating, but I would imagine we're far. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Then I would ask Stefania, would you like to ask your question? You're saying that you're teaching a course on sustainable fashion. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the panelists and to the organizers for this really interesting talk. I'm, like I said in the comment, teaching a new course at my university on sustainable fashion. That gives me hope, I have to say. The education system, hopefully, is a really strong mechanism for change. The students in the class are exceptional and are really just keen to do something different. They are shocked and horrified pretty much with every lecture, but are also filled with a lot of different opportunities as well. They see a lot of opportunities on the horizon. And in particular, one that we see as a major trend is the secondhand clothing market. And that's even set in some cases to surpass new clothing markets in terms of dollar for dollar investments. One retailer, one charity we work with sees upwards of about $1 million of sales just from their used clothing. And that's, you know, $1 or $2 per item. So this is a huge amount of clothing that they're shifting. They are still having to get rid of clothing. They bale it and that gets sent abroad. So that's something to be concerned, even if we don't purchase those you know, textiles made out of polyester and so on, that still gets sent to another country where they typically burn it. So it's just displacing the impacts, I suppose, elsewhere. But my question, I think, to everybody here is really just their opinions and thoughts about the secondhand market, and even just about the end of life cycle, where we see a lot of retailers thinking about shredding and recycling fibers. We see some greenwashing as well. H&M and others are taking items back, recycling them, giving you a coupon for further, you know, purchases. So just a lot of things to think about, but I would just love to hear any of your thoughts around this particular phase. Thank you.
So big fan of secondhand market, and as you say, you know, it's such a growing trend, and I very much, I hope that, you know, that's where most of the future of fashion is going to sit, no? Because like we've touched a lot during this conversation, we are producing clothes that we don't need, you know, so there are enough clothes already to go around for everybody, you know, for a very long period of time, and let's say satisfy all our needs in terms of like taste and sizing and whatever. I think so there's something quite interesting that is happening with secondhand. So a couple of things are oops, sorry, just got out. So one thing is that I don't know if in the US there are, you know, large secondhand applications for exchanging clothes. In the UK, for example, there is the POP. It's really leading the market now when it comes to secondhand exchange, and it's really fantastic for that. What you see though is a lot of sellers. So a lot of people are taking, you know, riding this wave of like secondhand and like getting, you know, like cheaper clothes and buying like a lot of fast fashion and then reselling it. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself well. So, you know, while I think as a consumer, it's really good to go to secondhand, I think what secondhand is doing in some cases and with some audiences is that it's fueling more, you know, this like interest in buying new clothes and getting like lots of cheap clothing, because people know that now they can sell it and make money of it and then buy more clothing. So I think that for me is, you know, like the risk and the damaging area of this trend, which still I think, you know, it needs to be the future, and it's about like us finding, you know, like really pivoting more towards a secondhand. But I think you see a lot of, I mean, you see, right, that, you know, if you spend hours browsing through secondhand platforms, most of the clothes are like fast fashion and most of them haven't been worn. So basically what's happening is that it's just enabling us to think even less about what we buy new. But absolutely, you know, supportive of it as a trend and as a solution for the industry.
I was just reflecting, maybe your students would be interested in evaluating and looking at the OR Foundation, OR and then Foundation. I don't know if that's a familiar resource. There was an open education series, I think late last week by Slow Factory on fashion and waste that was free. That might also be a good resource. The reality for some of the, I think in Accra, there was a huge fire recently, and I think it was December 15th, where is it Contamino, the place where all the bales end up in West Africa have become part of a local economy for, you know, repurposing those clothes and getting them out. So while we've been, you know, fast fashion's been around long enough that we have created some economic systems without a lot of oversight or intentionality. Like H&M doesn't dictate or invest in what's going on in Accra. And when there's a fire, they don't go in and support those communities who've been repurposing their clothes now for possibly up to 2 decades and help these people rebuild. So again, it's a de facto circular system, but it's a very important economic component of West African, at least if I'm reading, you know, these secondhand accounts accurately. Again, I'm not in those countries. I always like to feel like primary source interviews are the best way to base one's thinking. But what I've been told is that it's a really careful dance, because now that we've set up these systems where exports of fast fashion are flooding these systems, how do we start to support because they've actually displaced, our offshoots have displaced the endemic fashion economy in those countries. So, you know, it's not going to be like a snap of the finger that we help just, you know, we just pull out completely from this waste model and then all these communities suddenly rebound with their traditional weaving and dye traditions. Like it could be that we have to be extremely thoughtful and nuanced because we've disrupted a system of this. So not all the clothes are incinerated. Some of them are becoming apparently part of a very, very viable economy in other countries. So we've created a lot of things that we need to consider thoughtfully around secondhand markets. Not an expert, but the more I research, the more I'm like, oof, delicate.
Complexity of any kind of system change, right? It always becomes very complicated very fast. Thank you. I'm wondering, Bailey, would you like to ask your question? And I understand this is probably a US American thing.
Yeah, yes. Hello. I'm wondering if Rebecca would be interested in being the fashion czar that everyone has been talking about. And this is a little off topic, but I've been thinking of Rebecca as you as a saint. I've been getting in touch with my Brazilian ancestry, and like every town has saints that transformed the culture and helped people. And so I've been calling you Santa Rebecca. Oh. And I'm like, if you don't want me to, I'll stop calling you that. But would you be up for the job? And then if you're not, who do you think would be a good person for that position? Thank you.
So sweet. Oh my goodness. That is so kind. Overwhelmed with gratitude. Well, I think the fashion czar conversation was floating through my mind yesterday. I haven't thought a ton about it. It was just a recent thought, and we advocate for one. Our organization does. So ultimately, yes, I would take a position as such. And not that I don't think I'm the right person for the job though, but I almost think a round table would be nice. I'm always into like multiple, there's the czar. I mean, ultimately the czar idea didn't originate with like Fibershed, but we support it. But again, the idea of stakeholders coming together is so empowering. So I hope that the czar actually becomes a decentralized mini hub think tank. Maybe in that think tank, oh gosh, there's so many amazing thinkers out there. I'd probably put a mini coalition together. I really like what I'm seeing out of like the Aroa Foundation. I think they're really having a nuanced conversation around the waste. I like what's happening at Slow Factory. Professional troublemakers, I think, have a role. Celine. I think agriculture needs to sit at this table. I think Elizabeth Klein having a real voice in talking about the twilight of the ethical consumer. There's a role as us as citizens and wearers. We got to kind of walk and chew gum. I love that message. So I hope that all these voices find a way to come together if the fashion czar role is instituted. I hope we have space for, and there's so many people I'm not mentioning that I should be, but sorry. But it's a great question. It's a powerful time that we're even considering such a thing.
Cool.
It's exciting. Thank
you so much.
Thank you. So sweet.
Wonderful. I would hand over to Isabella for her question.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation, and I think it's an incredibly powerful time. I come at this from a designer maker point of view, and my passion is, I guess because I've been in repairs, that's where my kind of passion lies, but there's so many aspects of this conversation that deserve exploring further. I think we could all talk for hours, I expect. My question that arose kind of naturally out of your conversation was around this lack of technical knowledge, technical systems, tools even, to facilitate the regenerative movement. And also, down to the textile production side of it, I've been trained in garment construction on a very traditional basis, around bespoke and couture techniques. And it's interesting to think what the future is going to be, and that we need educators to kind of be thinking ahead so that we're training young people in this already, and people who are engaging in this sector from the very beginning. And I just wondered whether there are any educational institutions that are already providing very technical courses. Obviously, we've got some great courses coming through in sustainability and fashion, which is brilliant. But I wonder if you're aware of any that are providing regenerative agricultural courses, and also any other technical courses around this topic.
Well, real quick, there's a master's degree program at the Center for Regenerative Ag and Resilient Systems at Chico State University. And they are looking at bringing up the next generation of farm consultants. So if you have an interest in being a technical service provider, perhaps you're you're either your family's in ag or you have a real affinity for ag, that's the fodder for becoming a good TA. And Dr. Cindy Daly, who was at our symposium, spoke. She's the chair there, a wonderful female scientist and farmer, an organic dairy woman. who works with us in cotton systems. From an ag perspective, I know that there are programs starting within even big universities. There's a sustainable food systems capsule study program at UC Davis that did touch on fiber. One of the wonderful leaders at AgroLoop, Ricardo Garay, graduated from that capsule or that incubated program within UC Davis. And Dr. Amalie Godin is at UC Davis. She has a wonderful lab, and graduating incredible soil scientists and real systems thinkers. So I think again, there's probably so many people who could probably put in the chat. I'm only speaking from my place, so I don't know like largely what all those opportunities would look like, even nationally or internationally. But great question.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I think, I'm sure also, Ivo, you probably know some people that are doing this in Europe, but I know in Europe, in Spain, in Murcia, there is the Regeneration Academy that is an organization run by some farmers who have been doing regenerative agriculture for a very long time and are now working with different organizations to really like bring people in like little periods of time to learn and also to do research with them on how to scale these practices and how to interact better with the soil. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Absolutely. There's quite a lot out there. I still agree, like it wouldn't hurt at all to have more. It is something we're building with climate farmers to have this as an online resource. What we are seeing also is that the topic is arriving more and more also in universities. But it's a slow process. So I think we sort of have to pioneer it quite a bit in order to make it then accessible to academic institutions.
Yeah, and there's so much room for for new ideas and inventions around this. So getting other people, welcoming as many people as possible into it is, it's an exciting time. Thank you for answering.
Cool. Thank you, Isabella. Just with our last couple of minutes, I would hand the word to Jay and also again repeat what Oliver said. Let's also continue the conversation definitely on Mighty Network. So it would be great to stay in touch, but just to give the last couple of minutes there. Jay, would you like to ask a question?
Actually, I'm in precision ag, mostly on the data side. So I'm really just a student of all of this, and this is all kind of new to me, which is why I've really been so interactive here. So thank you all for this. This is really great. I really don't have a question, and if I did, I forgot. I forgot what it was.
I can read it out.
But thank you again.
Whether those smaller pockets of regenerative ag companies are helping to push the larger corporations towards supporting more regenerative practices as they see the consumer interest. Thanks for that one.
Such as Indigo Ag, companies like that.
Great.
So the question was basically whether sort of the small pioneer, if I understand you right, whether these sort of small pioneering companies, even though they might be small, are sort of having an outsized impact by pushing the conversation in the larger corporations forward.
Correct.
Is that a question?
It was when I wrote it in the chat. Yeah.
Is that a fashion oriented or ag focused question, Jay?
I think it's more of an ag focus. Wondering if Monsanto, Bayer, do they even feel the effect of these smaller companies, these smaller corporations? Do they? It seems like since like the North Face, I mentioned that they made a partnership with Indigo Ag. I was wondering if this sort of fuels a consumer interest, and if so, does it kind of like tilt the larger corporations to be more mindful, do you think?
They see it as a business opportunity. I don't know how deeply integrated their thinking around it is. And what I guess would generally concern me is that the business model, like when we tried to figure out if we could get a non-trait or non-GMO cotton seed for a project we're doing, had to ask the two seed purveyors in the state, not very many, if they would provide access to a non-trait seed. And of course, the germplasm still exists. They could develop a non-trait seed, but the basic thing that all the growers were saying is there's just no reason for them to, because without that patent, their business model doesn't. It was just put to me that frankly, like it was the first time, I've always had these ideas in my head that seed monopolies are probably, going to be counter to some of the goals we have to decentralize classical breeding and all these things. But I came face to face with it in this project. I was like, wow, we really can't get like easily on any, it's going to take years to get a non-trait seed for what we're trying to do that's, fusarium resistant. It has to work for the growers. The growers aren't going to bring in just whatever. Yes, there's non-trait seed in other states. Yes, there's non-trait seed in other countries. But to have a classical breeding program specified to our region, big journey, big investment, and no one's motivated by it because there's not a patent. So I'm not sure how motivated they are. I think on the surface, of course, they'll talk nicely about it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is sort of this ongoing question, right? Like we see change. I'm not so aware of this in the fashion sector, but in the agriculture sector, you have the same conversation, and you see huge commitments as recently by Nestle or others. And while this is obviously amazing, you're like, okay, do we mean the same thing? And I think this is sort of our job then to make sure that there's no way around meaning the same thing. And again, I think this is one of the things that we're looking forward to push a bit more on in the next couple of months and years. Sort of our time is running out, so I want to hand the final word maybe over again to Oliver for closing, and say thank you so much for the amazing conversation and going into the questions so deeply.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well. Thank you so much for your insights, for your experience, your wisdom, and the resources that you put out there. Could you quickly tell our audience where they can find out more information about you and how they can connect and contact with the organizations that you represent, starting with Aroa?
Yes, I will just put here our links and my email address if somebody wants to connect. The best.
Perfect.
I'll just do the same.
There we go. And before we wrap up, if anybody wants to save the chat, there's the option to do so at the bottom so that you don't lose the links and the questions that were here. But again, I will direct people over to our Mighty Networks link so that we can continue the conversation. We really want to keep momentum going with this so that we can make connections among our audience so that each of you can support each other's work, exchange ideas, and keep this movement going. So thanks again for everyone who showed up and for your questions and your participation. Thanks to Aroa and Rebecca. We'd love to have you back again in the future. And yeah, take care. We'll be in touch.